Hello and welcome to the Klassiki Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your window into the world of Eastern European film. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary titles, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, and much more. You can sign up for a free trial today at klassiki.online. If you enjoy the show, don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app of choice, and remember you can always get in touch with us at podcast@klassiki.online. Long-time listeners of the show will be familiar by now with the film historian Ian Christie, who's joined us in the past to discuss topics ranging from Alexander Sokurov to Paul and Pressburger, the Soviet avant-garde to the Zaragoza manuscript. Ian's many decades as a pioneer of Russian and Soviet film studies have informed his new book, The Most Important Art, Exploring the Hidden Histories of Russian and Soviet Cinema, which collects his writings and interviews on subjects ranging from the silent era to contemporary figures like Andrei Zvягintsev. Ian spent the tumultuous final years of the Soviet era travelling back and forth to the USSR, witnessing the social and cultural revolution that was unfolding, befriending many of the leading figures in the film industry, and helping to facilitate cultural exchange with the West. To celebrate the release of his new book, this week I invited Ian back on the pod to reflect on those experiences and to share his memories of encounters with artists like Andrei Tarkovsky, Kira Muratova, Elem Klimov, and many more. The Most Important Art, Exploring the Hidden Histories of Russian and Soviet Cinema, is on sale now from Sticking Place Books. Klassiki subscribers can explore a special watch list featuring many of the films that Ian discusses on this episode by following the link in the show description. Ian Christie, welcome back to the show. It's been a while.
Very nice to be back. Thank you.
Well, when I got my hands on this new collection of yours, this collection of essays and reminiscences, I knew that I had to send up the Ian Christie bat signal once again to get you back on the show, because there's just so much in here that I think is really fascinating for anyone who's interested in Soviet or Russian, and not just Russian, Soviet film history. And I think, the collection ranges from the silent era to Andrei Zvягintsev, in contemporary times. But I think maybe how we can center this conversation so we don't veer wildly in all directions would be to talk about your personal experiences in the late Soviet Union. So in the introduction to this book, you write about the roughly 10 years from 1979, when, if I'm not mistaken, was you first traveled to the Soviet Union, to, let's say, roughly, the end of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 90s. And you call it, in slightly tongue-in-cheek fashion, 10 years that shook Soviet cinema. And I guess, you seem to have had an endless array of adventures in that time and met all sorts of incredibly interesting people in the UK, in the Soviet Union, and beyond. So I guess to start with, if we're going to use that as the crux of this chat, 10 years that shook Soviet cinema. Obviously, this is the last decade of the Soviet Union, but what were the broad strokes? How would you describe in broad stroke terms the revolution or the upheaval that occurred in Soviet cinema in that last decade, the decade that you started really engaging with it?
Well, it was a really interesting period. Of course, we didn't know how interesting it would become. I think I have to keep reminding myself and reminding people I talk to that we didn't know what was coming, because, of course, everything is now colored by hindsight. So when I went in 79, I'd actually been as a tourist in the early 70s, but I went in 79 with a mission to look at new Soviet cinema and bring back a program for the National Film Theatre, as it then was, the BFI South Bank. And it was an interesting time, a very interesting time, because I went at the end of 79. I saw a range of films at Goskino, the traditional viewing theatre in the heart of Moscow, where films had been viewed and previewed and judged for decades. And I was reminded actually after my first weekend in Moscow that I was being followed. My minder from Goskino said, "Did you enjoy your trip to the Pushkin Museum?" I think to let me know that they knew I'd been, which indeed I had. And I viewed a bunch of films which were quite prophetic in some ways. I saw a film by Lana Gogoberidze, who is still happily with us. And in fact, I saw her in London, I think it was last year, and reminded her that I had actually written about one of her early films, which formed part of that program, some interviews on personal problems.
Which you can
And I
watch
said,
on Klassiki now. Just
oh,
to
good,
insert that
excellent.
one in there.
It's a
Featuring a
tremendous.
little video interview with the great Lana herself. Anyway, just
Yeah, I mean, she's delightful, and I didn't meet her then, but I was really struck by the film because it was a film that really, spoke about the personal, obviously, and it was a film by a woman about the kind of issues that women would write in about, with agony columns and so forth, were a big feature of the Soviet press at that time. And I also saw a film by the young partnership of Vadim Abdrashitov and Sasha Mindadze, who were making a name for themselves, making what I described as films of moral anxiety, modeled on the Polish example of the films that were being shown at that time. These were films that posed acute moral issues. And they were also films about middle class Russians. One of their films was about a middle class couple who had a car accident and they agonized over whether they should report it or not because it could get them into trouble.
mm.
These sorts of
Very Kishlovsky coded.
very Kieślowski, exactly. They were aware of that, and they were working in a sort of parallel way. But the film that we did show, Train Stopped, is an extraordinary film because it shows really how a train crash led to ripples of deceit, obfuscation, whitewashing, defending the gallant driver who had in fact caused the crash, and how nobody really wanted to get at the truth. And it ends with a memorial to people killed in the crash. And the central character walks away disgusted because he knows that basically the truth about this crash and why it happened has been completely covered up. That I thought was an extraordinary film to see, to be made and to be widely seen. But anyway, what happened was I chose my program of 7 or 8 films, went back to Britain, wrote up the notes, and suddenly the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan.
Ah.
And I think that was December or just at the end of the year. And suddenly my rather innocent program became a hot potato, a diplomatic hot potato. I actually saw on television, I'll never forget this, an announcement by the BBC that a visit by a delegation of Soviet filmmakers had been cancelled in protest. I rang up the Foreign Office and said, but we haven't invited anybody. They said, well, if you were thinking about it, don't. And I realized it was the beginning of a long realization that went on really, well, ever since, that there are many levels in which diplomacy is conducted with the Soviet Union. I found myself right in the eye of the storm over that program because there were loud denunciations of the very idea of showing Soviet films in early 1980 because of the Afghan war. And I pointed out that the films had nothing to do with that. And in fact, what they spoke of were very different currents at work in the Soviet Union, currents of real disquiet about the way things were going, a reflection of the stagnation that existed under Brezhnev. And the filmmakers were already sending out smoke signals in all sorts of ways that things had to change. And of course, they did begin to change at considerable speed. We had 2 leaders in rapid succession, Andropov and Chernenko, and then we had Gorbachev.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say that I'm glad that you just kind of landed on Gorbachev there at the end because obviously, I mean, people who think about this stuff understand, Gorbachev, Perestroika, Glasnost, which is from the kind of mid 80s onwards as this moment of explosion, of liberalization, and so on. But I think it's really interesting that you say that, in the years before that, even in a industry as tightly controlled and dependent on state funding and so on as cinema, as feature film production, it was already there. The mood was already there, and I think it's interesting and a shame that yeah, to this day, people probably aren't really familiar with people like Gogo Baridze or Abdurashitov, who you mentioned. What was before you went in 1979, sent by what's now the BFI to do a little digging around, what was the sense of Soviet cinema or the kind of horizons of it? People were obviously aware of Tarkovsky and I'm not sure who else. I'm asking as a sadly younger person here. What was the sense of like the limits of Soviet cinema at the end of the 70s when you arrived? What were the preconceptions?
But when I went first, I was armed with a list of things I should ask about.
All right.
Many earnest observers of the scene said, you must ask what's happening to Andrei Rublev, Tarkovsky's much delayed, censored, abbreviated film. And I was also told I must ask about Parajanov, Sergei
Mm.
Parajanov, the case of Parajanov being imprisoned and the kind of the contradictory information about what conditions he was being imprisoned, was he being prevented from working, etc., etc. This was all churning around, and people wanted me to be the person who went and asked questions, and I did. In fact, I experienced that kind of that wall of bureaucracy. Like I sent in a list of films I wanted to see, and instead they delivered to the viewing theater different films. And I developed a sort of speed viewing technique. Sometimes just to get through some of the films they'd sent, I would watch every other reel. Films were in reels in those days. So to this day, there are still some Soviet films where I would have seen reels 1, 3, 5, 7.
I
And
mean, we've all with our digital screeners skipped through
yeah,
10 seconds at a time.
skipping was harder when you had a projectionist behind you and you had to give him instructions.
Yeah.
But one of my interpreters, I had some wonderful interpreters who were very sort of forceful and extremely well educated, very well informed. And I remember one of my interpreters in the early 80s said to me, "Okay, you're not getting to see what you want to see. Let us rehearse you having a tantrum." So I swear we did rehearse me banging the table and having a tantrum. We just wanted to get the interpreting of it.
Can't imagine you banging a table.
Well, no,
Yeah.
I think I had to be wound up to it, but it was my interpreter who said you must. But then, just to jump into the Gorbachev period during the 85, never to be forgotten by me and by others who were there, the 85 Moscow Film Festival, which turned out to be a very, very big event indeed, a real
Yeah,
watershed
a real
moment.
turning point, that one.
I was tapped on the shoulder along with a number of other foreign visitors and told to come away and be taken in a black car to a special screening of what turned out to be my friend Ivan Lapshin
By Alexei German.
by Alexei German. A film that I don't think anybody had really heard about it. It had been made several years before. It was made either in 83 or 84. I think Shevardnadze, who was very active in film policy, Gorbachev's partner in this new regime, wanted to try out reactions to it. And I think this was very much a tryout screening to see if foreigners could understand Ivan Lapshin, because it's a difficult film to understand. It's got layers of narrative complexity, and it's also very laconic, as the Russians would say. It doesn't fill in the gaps. You have to orient yourself. I thought the film was wonderful. I had an interpreter who had read the books by Alexei German's father, which it's partly based, and she was able to help guide me through it. So I had tremendous benefit from a highly literate interpreter who really knew the background to it. When the film got released as one of the flagship films of Perestroika, a lot of people were very against it. They said, "Oh, it's whitewashing, Soviet secret police."
Well, a lot of people in the Soviet Union, you mean?
No, no, in the West.
Oh, okay.
And I spent a lot of time introducing screenings of the film, going around talking about it to people, trying to explain where it was coming from,
Hmm.
and trying to say, no, it's not what you think it is. It's the reason why uh, Russians, Soviet citizens, are so excited by the film is because it's showing a chapter in the life of the 30s from a non-sensationalist point of view. It's showing what daily life in a communal household was like, based on German and his father's own experience.
Yeah. I mean, I think we'll probably end up coming back to the mid 80s and that series of turning points, like the 1985 film festival and what happens in 1986, where the kind of bureaucracy of Soviet film is completely replaced and it opens things up. I just going back to your earlier forays across the Iron Curtain, I'd love to know about what it was like when you visited Mosfilm, visited the studios. I'm not quite sure, I can't, off the top of my head, what year was that you were
I think it was
wandering
probably
around the back lots?
84, 85.
Okay.
I'd become a friend of the Filmmakers Union, which was a great dynamo for change. And there were
Mm,
some wonderful people working at the union in the foreign relations department who were very progressive. And they would organize anything for me. And I said, I'd like to visit Moss Film Studios. And they said, right, sure, we can do that. So I was taken in the regulation big black car to Moss Film Studios, and I was ushered on set. A Soviet filmmaker was making a version of J.B. Priestley's Time in the Conways.
right.
J.B. Priestley was really, really popular in the Soviet Union. And Inspector Calls, his famous play, which was revived recently, was actually premiered in the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. It had its very first outing there. And Priestley was a well-known figure. And the director was delighted to have a Brit on set. He showed me the setting. He pointed to a picture on the wall of a portrait of Priestley and explained that his little joke was to have a portrait of Priestley in the set. And I remember meeting one of the directors of the studios, and he said, we can show you our parking lot of military vehicles. We have examples of every military vehicle from the Civil War onwards, just in case we might need them for typical Soviet war films.
Yeah.
And there was a gigantic park of military vehicles of every conceivable kind as far as the eye could see. And at one point he said to me, "Oh, it's really just like your Pinewood." And I thought to myself,
No, it's not.
Pinewood was never like this.
Fewer tanks in Pinewood.
I actually had been to Pinewood, and it certainly wasn't like that at all. It was very make do and mend at that time. So it was really seeing the throbbing heart of Soviet cinema as it was before things began to change quite dramatically.
Yeah.
Because indeed, after 85 and 86, things did change quite dramatically. Although this vast acreage of Mosfilm was still sitting there.
Yeah, I mean, something you've always been very good at pointing out is the connections between British and Soviet or Russian culture. I feel like you're always pointing out how much Eisenstein loved Dickens, or how much this or that Soviet director loved G.K. Chesterton or P.G. Wodehouse or something. I feel like that's the real Ian Christie calling card, is the attention to that strange strain of Anglophilia that sits with all the Anglophobia in Russian culture.
Well, it's true. I mean, I was very surprised. I remember the deputy director of the Film Art Institute earnestly said to me, did I and my family still read Galsworthy? And I said, no, we didn't, because
Such
Galsworthy was still
such a Russian question that.
it's a
Yeah.
very Russian question. And he was perfectly serious. He thought I would say yes enthusiastically. But then on the other side, when I got to know Leonid Trauberg very well across the 80s, who was one of the founding figures of the Soviet avant-garde, as part of the FX group, the Factory of the Eccentric Actor. Leonid and I became very friendly indeed. And he was really proud of the fact that his daughter, Natasha, had become the leading translator of Chesterton
Mm,
in Sweden. And there was a huge cult of Chesterton, which that was mind-boggling. There are all these kind of discoveries. It was a different version of English culture that they knew, but my goodness, they knew it really well in ways that
yeah.
Britain didn't, and they valued it.
Well, I mean, people can go back and listen to I think it was maybe the first episode that you were on the Klassiki Podcast, where we talk all about Leonid Trauberg and FX and that kind of branch of the Soviet avant-garde, just while we're doing kind of anecdotes, there's a great anecdote where through Trauberg you get to visit the cinema veterans house, and one of the someone there just has a copy of all the reels of Intolerance by Griffith. How did what's that story?
Extraordinary. I was taken to the House of Veterans, which is a retirement home for people from Soviet cinema, a very handsome place on the outskirts of Moscow, Matveyevskoy. And one of the people I was introduced to, uh, Boris Wolf, I think was his name, what the oldest person in the home, and he told the story, which he'd obviously told many times, that he acquired a bunch of reels of a film, didn't know what it was, and was told by a cinema operator that what he got was a copy of Griffith's Intolerance.
Where did he get it? Who gave him?
Well, it had been left behind. Apparently, what had happened was that the Russians, the Americans, of course, had been very active in Russia, doing famine relief and all sorts of things. I mean, there's a whole other untold story about Western efforts to alleviate famine and hardship, which starts before the revolution and continues after it for a period of time.
Mm,
That's a whole other story. This had been left behind, I believe, when an American institution of some kind had closed down. They just left the reels behind. And it seems likely that this is the source of one of the most famous stories in the history of Eisenstein and Russian cinema, which is that all the Russians knew Griffith's Intolerance.
mm.
Because how would they have known it had there not been a print left behind? I have no way of checking this, but it seems very likely that was the copy that they all got to see. Because what I did learn from Trauberg was that copies of pre-revolutionary material that had found its way into Russia were enormously highly prized, and they played them, until the prints disintegrated.
Yeah, I guess that story somewhat relates. If I'm segueing here into something else I wanted to talk to you about, which is one of the things that's so interesting about the book and about your work from that time more generally is that how involved you were really directly in facilitating the movement of filmmakers to and from the West and the Soviet Union. So you were involved in bringing not just films, but then later on, like filmmakers to London, and I'd love to talk about that. But also bringing there's this whole episode where you helped to bring a bunch of independent British filmmakers to Moscow, including Derek Jarman, Peter Wall, and Sally Potter, which is kind of amazing to think about. I mean, it's not to ask too open-ended a question, but what did Derek Jarman and Sally Potter make of 80s Moscow? What was that whole anything spring to mind?
Oh, lots of things do. It again was it was an invitation from the Filmmakers Union. They
Mm,
said, we have heard about these independent filmmakers in the West, but we never see any of their work, because it's important to remember that the only foreign films that were shown regularly in commercial cinemas in Russia were just sort of dross, cynically shipped in by the major studios. So they had never seen this kind of work, which was exciting people here in the 1980s. So I assembled a delegation. I invited people who were my friends, acquaintances in Britain. What there was indeed Derek Jarman, who was keen to come, Sally Potter, who was an extremely avant-garde filmmaker at that point. She'd made The Gold Diggers and Thriller, some of her early films. Peter Wallen came. Peter Greenaway was due to come, but couldn't. He was working on another film, although we did take the draftsman's contract. And Edward Bennett,
mm,
who'd had a big success with his film Ascendancy, and Peter Sainsbury, who was head of BFI production. And we traveled around as a little group. We were in Moscow, and we were shown a lot of films, including films that hadn't been released yet. More Alexei German, 20 Days Without War.
oh, wonderful film.
It was stunning. And I mean, I remember Derek in particular was really, really, impressed by it. We went to Azerbaijan. It was standard practice in the Soviet era that you had to pay a visit to a republic.
Yeah.
You didn't have any choice in the matter. We were told Azerbaijan is where we're going. And we went and we saw some interesting films. We met some people. We discovered an extraordinary sculpture by a naive sculptor who had created this vast memorial to his daughter who had been drowned. I've got dozens of photographs of Derek and Sally wandering around looking at this amazing structure. It's a bit like sort of Le Facteur Cheval. It's a huge temple. And Derek, at one point, got out of our van. He spotted a Zoroastrian fire temple.
Mm.
He said, "I'm a Zoroastrian," and knelt down in Azerbaijan. Flames were coming out of the ground. It is a very Zoroastrian area. And I have a photograph of Sally watching Derek making his obeisances at a Zoroastrian fire temple. So it had a very exotic feeling about it. And all the while, Derek was filming with his Super 8 camera, which we were very worried about because we thought it's going to get us into trouble. And he did film some very interesting stuff in the Eisenstein Museum in Moscow and elsewhere. And later that became his amazing film, Imagining October.
Yeah.
Is to some extent a record of that visit, but it's also a fiercely anti-Thatcher film, which kind of contrasts repression in the Soviet Union with the kind of repression that Derek felt was going on at home with the prohibition of homosexuality under Thatcher.
And there's a moment where he announces to an audience.
Yes.
He's giving a talk somewhere, and he announces loudly that Shakespeare was gay, and
Exactly.
his interpreter is kind of pulling at the collar.
No. The interpreter, who was a wonderful woman, Bella Epstein, was the great interpreter. She was amazingly adept. She was the Filmmakers Union head interpreter. Bella told us about this afterwards, and she said, she was delighted to be interpreting for Derek when he made this ringing statement, because, of course, this went down in very different ways amongst different academicians. But it was a period when you felt you could get away with anything, and there were no immediate repercussions. We felt very free. At the same time, we had a sense that the ground was shifting beneath us. So this is 84. So if you like, Troika hadn't struck yet. And of course, all the revelations that would start to come out in 86 and 87 hadn't begun yet. So we were just on the cusp. It was a very interesting time.
And then conversely, what about when you started being able to get Soviet filmmakers to London, say? I mean, you've told me the story before about, was it Tarkovsky at the BFI, Tarkovsky and Muratova?
Yes, at very much at different times. Tarkovsky came early on for the release of Stalker.
Okay, so that's earlier in the 70s.
I was chosen to be his interlocutor on stage at the National Film Theatre. And he really was like a frightened rabbit. I mean, he'd not been out, except, I think, to one or two festivals. And I think he was very worried that he would put a foot wrong. Tatiana Storchak was sitting in the front row with her beady eye on him.
Who's that? Sorry.
Oh, well, she was quite a well-known figure in the back. She would eventually become rector or vice-rector of Geek, the film school, but she was widely regarded as a KGB operative.
Right, okay.
Soviet filmmakers. And Tarkovsky just wanted to be he wanted to slip off the leash. He really wanted to see commercial American films, but he didn't want it to be known that he wanted to see them. So people were showing him high-minded art films, and he wasn't really very interested in those, interestingly. It was, you could see that he wanted to experience cinema on the outside in its raw form, not to be told what to watch. He also stressed something which every visitor stressed, which was the incredible freedom that filmmakers had under the Soviet system. There are so many versions of this story, but I mean, the basic story is that if your project was accepted by one of the production units at Lenfilm or Mosfilm, you could make the film with no interference. The interference came after you'd finished it. And then your film would be viewed, and it would either be classified for a first level, second level, or third level release. Fair enough. There could be calls for censorship, or it could be banned. But it was by no means, the system was more more complex than people often give it credit for.
Yeah.
Abdurashitov told me once that some changes were demanded in one of his films, and they couldn't find anybody in the studio who was willing to make the cuts. So that there was that level of resistance when Tarkovsky made Stalker, because of a processing error. It had to be entirely reshot, and Yulia Reisman, who was head of the unit that Tarkovsky was part of, told me perfectly straightforwardly, yes, we had to cancel another film so that we could reshoot the Tarkovsky film. So what people, I think, didn't realize was that it actually ran as a kind of pretty rational system up to the point where some films were judged to be politically undesirable. Then, of course, they went on the shelf.
On the shelf, yeah. And so when was it that maybe I'm misunderstanding the chronology here, but when was it that, say, the likes of Alexander Sokurov and Kira Muratova were coming to London? Was that also in the 80s, or was that
Yeah,
later?
that was in the 80s. That was in 87, 88.
Okay, so
The beginning of perestroika was visible. Sakurov's film, the one that has the impossible to translate title, Heartbreak House, is what I called it, or Anesthesia Dolorosa, is a very, very strange film, had been in Berlin, and people found it incomprehensible. But I invited him to London, and Kira Muratova, and several other filmmakers, and they had a panel discussion on the stage of the National Film Theatre, and they all started arguing amongst each other.
I was going to say Sokurov and Muratov are extremely
Yes,
different sensibilities. That's not.
totally,
I would
totally.
not line them up together.
We had a party for them at Claire Kitson's, and they were very civil to each other. But once we got them in a sort of delegation situation, they were arguing furiously because they were very different kinds of filmmaker. Yeah, but great filmmakers doing very individual things. And what began to happen under Klimov, when Klimov became first secretary of the Filmmakers Union in '86, he started the process of unshelving banned films. He created a conflict commission headed by the critic, Andrei Plachov, and filmmakers were invited to come and explain, what they'd done and why it should be released. And he was very funny. I got to know Klimov very well. He said, "You were nobody in those days if you hadn't had a film banned. It was really important to show that you had suffered." And he said there were some rather pathetic examples of filmmakers who came trying to make a case that they too had been discriminated against.
This is just for clarity. This is L.M. Klimov, who
Sorry,
people will know as the director of Come and See,
yes.
another kind of classic of the 80s.
The story, the brief backstory of Klimov, which is an important one, I think, and very typical of the period, was that Klimov was elected by intervention from above. Let's say he was Gorbachev and Shevardnadze's choice to become first secretary in '86. All of the previous board was swept away. But Klimov, the reason he was such an important figure, this sent a signal to the entire filmmaking community. This was a man who'd had all his previous films delayed, shelved, or banned. And he'd made what, 4 or 5 films up to that point. They'd all suffered terrible delays. And suddenly here he was in charge of the Filmmakers Union. His triumphant film at the 1985 Moscow Film Festival, Come and See, was absolutely, it stunned people. It's a film of such ferocity about the war, the Nazi invasion of Belarusia, which is made with such ferocity that I think it just left everybody speechless, shocked.
So yeah, like you say, once we get to kind of 1986 and the heads of the kind of filmmaking bureaucracy are replaced with people like Klimov, and you start to get the great unshelving process. And then this is how basically, a lot of films that are now considered Soviet classics are seen, in the Soviet Union for the first time, like Muratova's early films, not 20 years, 15 or so years after the fact, or an amazing film like Alexander Askodov's Commissar, which is now, it's part of every film course. I've taught it many times as, this classic film of Russian Soviet cinema, but, no one had seen it until kind of 20 years after it was made. So what was the effect on these filmmakers who you were friends with, these people in the Soviet Union, at this sudden kind of rush of newly available,
Well,
their own film
there were,
history suddenly kind of coming to light?
yeah, there were two kinds of reactions, I suppose, just to simplify it, but very extreme. Films of Muratov in particular, and Sakharov to some extent, which had been made long before and shelved, they were treated as, yes, fantastic discoveries. And indeed, both Muratova and Sakharov especially got tremendous boost from the Filmmakers Union, said, we will do everything to make your films available. And almost overnight, Sakharov became one of the most widely viewed filmmakers because his films were on television even in the late 80s. It's extraordinary. But Askoldov, who had made The Commissar, Askoldov remained bitter because
Mm.
Askoldov had made this extraordinary film and it'd been shelved, and he'd been forced out of cinema. He'd made one film, and he was forced to eke out a career, a living. I think doing theatre mainly, but it was the beginning and the end of his career in film, and he felt that he'd never had the support from the rest of the profession that he should have had, and he remained quite dissident in the face of. I mean, he was delighted that the film was seen. I was with him in Toronto where I did a big retrospective in 1988. I remember sitting beside him, and he got, he was cheered to the rafters, and must have been very gratifying all those years after he made the film to see people responding to it. But he remained at odds with the filmmaking establishment, even in its new form, and I think he remained that way to the end of his life. He felt that if they had shown some solidarity, they could have supported him. So not everybody, was over the moon. It wasn't as simple, it wasn't a magic wand, but it certainly meant that filmmakers were freer. New, younger filmmakers were free to come forward and make extraordinary films that could never have been contemplated before. I mean, I'm thinking of, for instance, Kaidanovsky, Alexander Kaidanovsky, who is better known as the actor at the center of Tarkovsky's
Yeah,
Stalker.
he is the
He
stalker
is the
in
Stalker,
Soviet.
precisely.
Yeah.
But he directed, I think, 3 films altogether. And one of his films in particular, the sort of strange title, the Kerosene Seller's Wife,
Hmm.
is a real piece of Soviet sort of magic realism. It's an extraordinary film, visionary, haunting. It's got an angel in it. It's got all sorts of amazing things in it. That would never have been imaginable in the years before Perestroika. So it was a time when filmmakers were going in so many different directions. And of course, they were also Tarkovsky had died in exile in 86, and that was felt as a terrible loss. I remember actually a KGB minder saying to me in the airport when I was leaving Moscow, just after Tarkovsky's death had been announced, this minder turned to me and said, "We have lost our greatest filmmaker." There was, it went right through Soviet society. People knew that Tarkovsky was an important figure. In my book, I have a long interview with Andrei Konchalovsky. He's very frank indeed about the whole span of his own career as the only Soviet filmmaker who ever managed to work abroad and come back and work back in Russia. And he knew Tarkovsky very well, of course, and they were both in Cannes together. And he talks in the interview about their discussions about whether to defect or not to defect.
Hmm.
It was very rife amongst the whole creative community at the time. But he also says, unflinchingly, that Tarkovsky was an idiot politically. Very
Yeah.
naive in Konchalovsky's view. And I would urge anyone who wants to reflect on this period just to read the Konchalovsky interview, because I think he's just so wonderfully candid. I mean, you can argue with him, you can disagree with him, but he lays it all out and explains a lot of the twists and turns amongst, you know, the Soviet upper class, shall we say, the privileged, who had privilege, but they also had boundaries and limits. And of course, he's the brother of Nikita Mikhalkov,
Oh
the
dear.
once hugely promising filmmaker and actor who became a sort of mouthpiece for Putin and Putinism,
Yeah.
very sadly.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I can second it is a great interview with Konchalovsky.
Well, I
Uh,
mean, what what I take away from my experience of the 1980s, when I was in Russia a great deal, and not so often since, is the sense in which Soviet cinema was functioning as a great kind of echo chamber of what people were thinking. And I think it's difficult, perhaps, for us to appreciate just how important it was. I mean, the attendance was massive.
Mm.
People took film seriously, very seriously. And I remember being in a screening in Moscow of a film by Roman Balayan called Flights in Dreams and Reality. And you felt that the whole audience was following the what this film was saying about a generation, the generation of people who had been liberated by the Khrushchev reforms, and then found that stagnation hit, and all their dreams and hopes and so forth were crushed, and they became, in the traditional Russian phrase, superfluous men.
And
They
women.
had no, they had no function anymore. Everything had been the air had been let out of the balloon, and so films could do that. And this meant that when very critical late films of the perestroika period, films like Repentance, the ghost of Stalin not being laid to rest, as it were, and particularly Little Vera, those films hit home to a degree that is hard to credit. Little Vera in
Yeah,
particular.
Little Vera was a sensation. This is this film by Vasily Pichul about kind of youth discontentment and kind of nihilism and cynicism amongst these
But it's also a film
late
about
Soviet
life in the
teenagers.
Rust Belt
Yeah,
of the Soviet Union. It's a decaying industrial town where the kids are out, smoking, drinking, etc. The parents are drinking themselves to death, and it's a film that offers no hope, no way out. Everybody's moral fiber, as it were, has been shot to pieces. And I think there was a book published, as far as I remember, of reactions to Little Vera, because
mm.
people did write in and let rip about what they thought about Soviet films. And I think I remember one comment that came from a viewer somewhere in the Soviet Union saying, if this is what Soviet society has produced, then there's no hope.
Well,
It was
that's the joke of the title because the name Vera means
little,
faith,
little hope. Yes,
I believe.
exactly.
So the Little Vera, the
Yes,
title of the film means no hope.
no hope. No, absolutely, and that was not lost on Soviet viewers. But I think it did mark it. My own feeling is that films like Little Vera and Is It Easy to Be Young did play a material part in weakening the resolve to continue the Soviet regime. Of course, you can't totally evaluate that, but I think there's no question that the scale of the reaction and the negativity of the reaction to them and the sense of hopelessness that they engendered was just devastating. And I think that when the political upheavals at the end of the 90s happened, people didn't want to go on. They knew things had to change, and as it happened, the vehicle of change that they chose was Yeltsin, who,
Mm.
who I had shared a platform with at the Moscow Film Festival in 1985 when he was a completely unknown figure. He pushed his way on stage. This enormous, he was a very big guy, appeared suddenly on the stage at the Moscow Film Festival. Everybody said, "Who's that? Who's that?" He had no idea who he was. But that was
That was
the
Boris
figure of the
Yeltsin.
man who would be the coming thing.
Okay, you really are Forrest Gump for late Soviet cinema, in. And just your point is obviously entirely correct. Cinema can't play that powerfully into a sense of political disaffection unless people take cinema very seriously.
Yeah,
Which, whatever else you want to say about Soviet film culture, took it very seriously.
they did.
Well, I think that's with Yeltsin barging onto the stage. I think that's a pretty good, symbolically speaking, a pretty good place to wrap it up for today. But Ian Christie, it's always a pleasure, and we'll include links to this book. It's if you want a tour through Soviet cinema, then it comes highly recommended. And yeah, we'll include some links as well for people to watch the films we've been talking about, the ones that are available on Klassiki. But yeah, Ian Christie, as always, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you very much, Sam. It's a great pleasure to reminisce. Thank you.